back to Pastoral Preaching and Teaching. And we're going to continue looking at the 6 marks of leadership in Nehemiah. We're going to look at Mark 5. He organizes his work. That's in Nehemiah chapter 3. I read a small book many years ago when I was pastoring my first church full time. And I was trying to grow this church, lead this church into growth. And this statement just jumped out. Most pastors are not overworked. They are underorganized. And I think you can identify with that. If you are pastoring or leading any kind of ministry, we definitely can get overworked. and organizing, following the example of Nehemiah in chapter 3, can really help us. I think it was Chuck Swindoll who said that Nehemiah 3 is like a Hebrew phone book of hard-pronounced names. But in reality, Old Testament scholar Howard Voss is more accurate when he says that Nehemiah 3 is an incredible feat of organization. This is, again, it's first person because all of Nehemiah is first person. But here, this is the rebuilding of the broken down walls. And you almost feel like Nehemiah has put on his hard hat and he's giving us a guided tour of the work site. The reconstruction of 2 miles of broken down walls of Jerusalem. 10 gates that were first the focus, because that's where the enemy would enter. But the rebuilding of the walls was not just a construction project, a building project. It was a spiritual construction. You remember what Nehemiah said to them when he gave that motivation, that speech to, we called it pastoral preaching, to motivate them to serve. Back in chapter 2, verse 17, Nehemiah said, "Then said I unto them," quote, "You see the distress that we are in, how Jerusalem lies waste, and the gates thereof are burned with fire. Come and let us build up the wall of Jerusalem, that we be no more a reproach on God." This is a building project. This is a spiritual project. This is to protect them from not only the physical harm of the enemies, but their false teaching. And this is a project to bring honor back to God. What Nehemiah does here is he starts at the sheep gate in chapter 3, verse 1. He moves counterclockwise, and he describes 41 workstations, 41 teams that he has organized around this wall. preceptaustin.org. You can go there, and it gives you a sort of a picture of what is going on. Here's the wall, and here would be the cities around the city of Jerusalem, so like subdivisions. And so you can go there and look at that, and you can read what is said about each of these gates. But I want us to look at what Thomas Constable has to say about this, because he talks about the maximalist view, that is the wall around the city being 2 1/2 miles, and the minimalist view, which is the view that the walls were 2 miles. Even in the minimalist view, that's a 2-mile wall enclosing about 90 acres. And Nehemiah is giving us again this guided tour And again, he starts with the sheep gate, if you look in chapter 3, verse 1. So that would be the north wall, the sheep gate. And then next is the fish gate in verse 3. So the north wall is Nehemiah's description of this as he's giving us this tour. But I'm going to go to Thomas Constable, netbible.org. So this is netbible.org, and I'm at Nehemiah. So I'm going to chapter 2. So I'm going to go to his commentary. And let you see this. There's the sheep gate, the fish gate, the old gate. And so you can see he's going counterclockwise. There's the valley gate. That's the north wall, the west wall, the south wall. Down here's the dung gate, fountain gate. Here's the east wall, water gate, horse gate, east gate, mustard gate. And then he goes full circle back to the sheep gate. So that's what we're reading about here in Nehemiah chapter 3. And Nehemiah is going to show us, as he gives us this guided tour, he is showing us the organization that he was able to put together. We're going to add another mark to the 6 marks of leadership. So far we have seen that the leader shows his or her concern for God's work. The leader prays for his or her people. The leader follows his leader. The leader motivates his followers. Now, here we are. The leader organizes his work. And again, Nehemiah is a lay leader. That's why I'm saying for this mark, we could say this for all of these marks. These are marks of lay leadership. And of course, those of us who are senior pastors, lead pastors, this is what we would want to accomplish, equipping lay leaders like Nehemiah. I remember going to a Awana conference in Charlotte one time. Had 800 Awana workers in attendance and only 10 pastors. And I'm asking the question, was that good or bad? Well, it was neither. But what would have been bad was 800 pastors and 10 Awana workers, because Awana is a lay workers ministry. And Nehemiah is showing us how lay leaders can lead. How did he lead? How can we equip lay leaders to lead? How can we, as not lay leaders but senior leaders, lead pastors or executive pastors, lead? Well, we're going to look at some excellent principles. Number 1, leaders divide the work into manageable sections. So here's this 2-mile wall that Nehemiah divided into 41 teams. And as he walks around this wall describing the construction that is happening, we see that he organizes huge, humanly impossible task, a task that has been undone for 100 years, is going to be done in a matter of weeks. In a matter of weeks is this wall going to be rebuilt. How did he do it? Well, he divided this massive task into manageable sections. We've heard these little quotes before. How do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. How do you start researching your research paper now? How do you write the paper for this class? Well, you start now. How do you read through scriptures in 1 year? You don't procrastinate until December. How do you train the people you want to help in your ministry, or even to take over some of your ministry? How do you do that? Well, you start now. You pick out someone. I was reading another book on training. staff members, for example, or different members. It could be paid or volunteer staff. This particular book was talking about adding paid staff, and they said, look for the person who is volunteering on their own. You haven't asked them. They are volunteering on their own to just get so heavily involved in the ministry of your church. Consider that person as a paid staff. If they're doing this voluntarily on their own, they're not going to be doing it just for a paycheck. They're already motivated. And I just thought that's wisdom. And so Nehemiah divides this work into manageable sections. He breaks it down. And then number two, and this is I think the biggest lesson out of this, the leader delegates responsibility and authority. We've heard the saying credited to D.L. Moody, I'd rather get 10 men to do the job than to do the job of 10 men. Nehemiah delegated responsibilities to those with a vested interest. So we go to chapter 3, verse 1. Then Eliashib the high priest rose up with his brethren, the priests, and they builded the sheep gate. Now, you see what Nehemiah's done? He has put the priest near the sheep gate because that's what they do. They make sacrificial offerings with sheep. They have an interest in that section of the wall. John Maxwell talks about putting people in their comfort zone and their gift zone. And I think we see this exemplified in Nehemiah. Next, Nehemiah also delegated to secure unity. Look in verse 2. And next unto him. That statement is found 28 times as Nehemiah is walking around this wall describing the construction that is happening. And next unto him. It was like a 2-mile unbroken circle of unity. Now, here's something important in verse 5. And next unto him, the Tekoaites repaired, but, look at this contrast, their nobles put not their necks to the work of their Lord. I'm so glad that Nehemiah was transparent and described everything that he saw. He didn't sugarcoat it. As great a leader as Nehemiah was, he did not get everyone to follow him. And that's just a reality that we have to accept. The nobles did not put their necks to the work. It's the expression found in Jeremiah 27:12 of 2 oxen who pull together, but one of the oxen is not willing to put its neck to the yoke and pull. Well, when that happens, it increases the workload of the other ox and of the other workers. And that's exactly what's happening in Nehemiah chapter 3. Nehemiah 3:4 talks about those who were working in unity. Verse 4, and next unto him repaired Meremoth, the son of Urijah, the son of Koz, and next unto him Meshullam. And so if you drop down to verse 21, you see these names reappearing. And verse 21, and after him repaired Meremoth, the son of Urijah, the son of Koz, another piece from the door of the house. So here's Meremoth having to work on 2 sections of the wall because the nobles of the Tekoaites were not willing to do their share. And again, this is the real world that we minister in. I have a pastor friend who made this incredible admission. He is He is a great pastor. He's a great leader. Pastors one of the largest churches in his area. But in his candid admission, he said, over the past 10 years, I've had more people to leave our ministry than to join our ministry. I thought, that's a very secure pastor to be able to make that kind of admission. But it encouraged the rest of us to know that we're not the only ones who have people to leave our ministry, or for those who will not put their neck to the yoke. And we've all heard this statement. James Montgomery Boyce quoted it. Churches, more than anything else, resemble a football game played in a large stadium where there's 80,000 spectators in the stands who badly need some exercise, and there are 22 men on the field who badly need rest. And that's true. You have like 20% of the people doing 80% of the work. We've heard that statistic. But Nehemiah was very successful at delegating responsibility. And one of the ways he succeeded was he asked him to work in areas that they had an interest in. Next, Nehemiah delegated according to their nobler interest. These workers of Tekoa, Gibeon, and Mizpah were like these suburbs, these smaller towns around the large city of Jerusalem, and yet they're helping build the walls of Jerusalem, not the walls to their individual cities, because they know if Jerusalem falls, then they're going to be like the collateral damage. But they were serving others for the benefit of all. I've heard church members say, why should I support the youth when I don't have any young people that from my family that are participating? Well, you want to support the youth ministry, to train the next generation so that we can practice 2 Timothy 2:2 to place into, to deposit the truth into the next generation, who will place it into the next generation and then the next generation. And Nehemiah tapped into this nobler interest. And then Nehemiah dedicated according to their abilities. You have, beginning in verse 8, as we walk with Nehemiah around this construction site, he identifies goldsmiths. He identifies goldsmiths and apothecaries and rulers. And they were all contributing according to their abilities. For example, the goldsmiths had soft hands for intricate work, and possibly they were working with the locks to keep the enemies out. You had rulers in verse 9. So not all of the rulers were like the rulers from Tekoa. You had rulers in verse 9. And next unto them repaired Rephaniam, the son of Hur, the ruler of the half part of Jerusalem. So here's these rulers, these leaders, being willing to get their hands dirty and work alongside the others. I just think that's a great quality. I remember when we were walking to chapel at BJ, and I saw the president heading into chapel, and he picked up someone's nasty Kleenex off the sidewalk because he wanted that campus to have a good testimony for those who would come and visit. And I just think it's a quality in a leader when he shows up for like work days at the church, and it just builds morale. Nehemiah delegated to all, including women and children and servants. You see those listed in verse 12. he delegated to those who were willing to work at the dung gate in verse 14. The dung gate, that's where the waste of the city was dumped. And I just thought, again, you have those people, thank God, in the church who are willing to do behind the scenes work that a lot of other people, they're just not going to do. And I've thought this, I would not want to ride on the back of a garbage truck. I would not want that as a job, but I'm glad somebody does. And they still are around. You see them once in a while. But thank God for those ministers, those members in our church who clean the bathrooms, for example, so they don't smell like porta potties on Sunday morning when we come in and visitors come into our bathrooms. That's a testimony. Nehemiah delegated to those willing to do mundane tasks. You have the Nethinims in chapter 3, verse 26, who hauled water. This probably goes back to Joshua 9 when the Gibeonites tried to deceive Joshua that they were not part of the Canaanites that Joshua and Israel were going to defeat, but they had traveled this long distance. They were discovered, and they became hewers of wood and haulers of water. Many people believe these are their descendants. Again, these are necessary ministries. You know, it's not a high IQ job necessarily, but they're so important. And I think about the people who make the first impression on our guests when they come, when they come and visit, the ushers, the greeters. They're the ones who give the first impression, not the choir, not the worship team or the pastor, but these folk who are willing to do such an important job that gives a good first impression of our ministry. Nehemiah delegated responsibility and authority. So he had 41 teams. So that means that Nehemiah was not a micromanager. He delegated not just tasks. They were not just gophers who went when he told them to go get something. He delegated responsibility and authority. And the walls went up. John Maxwell advocated a delegation principle when he said decisions should be made at the lowest level. In other words, the leader, like Nehemiah, should be making those most difficult decisions, but those on lower levels should be making decisions that affect their team. It's the lesson that Moses learned from Jethro. You've got to delegate this work, or you're going to burn out. You're going to kill yourself. You're working from sun up to sundown. You've got to delegate this to others for your benefit, but for the benefit of those people that you delegate authority to, that they can get the blessing of serving, and then the people are going to be better served. The apostles did that in Acts 6, 1-6, so they would not be drawn away from their primary ministry of preaching and praying. And the result, Luke records in Acts 6:7, the word of God increased and the number of the disciples multiplied. So what has Nehemiah done in organizing the work? He has divided the work into manageable sections. He has delegated responsibility and authority. And lastly, he has recognized his workers. 3 kinds of material in Nehemiah. You have the narrative that makes up 36%. Prayers make up 11%. But look at this. Over half of Nehemiah is the listing of names that helped Nehemiah and he recognized. Look at these principles. Leaders give credit to others. There are 75 names, 75 individuals forever listed in God's Word in Nehemiah chapter 3. Hans Finzel, in his book, The Top 10 Mistakes Leaders Make, said this: compliments, by their very nature, are highly biodegradable and tend to dissolve hours or days after we receive them, which is why we always can use another one. That's neat. And Hans Finzel says, be sending out those thank you emails and texts and even cards and notes. I like the concept of the Workers' Appreciation Banquet. We have done this many times. It is so successful. It is so biblical. But it's where you have this meeting. You have we've had a pig picking before and just all kinds of whatever, catered or covered dish. But you try to recognize every person, at least every group, if you cannot recognize every person, but every person or group that does something in your church. Wow. And a good time to do this is before a nomination of people for the coming year. That way it's not so difficult to get people to volunteer to help, because appreciation has been shown. Leaders do not take credit for themselves. Whose name is conspicuously absent in Nehemiah 3? Nehemiah. I think Luke was that kind of leader. Luke wrote the Gospel of Luke, and then he followed that up with the book of Acts. More material than any other author in the New Testament. Paul wrote more books. Luke wrote more material. But he does not refer to himself in that. Jim Collins, in his book Good to Great, talks about how companies move from good to great. And you can read that. But here's what I really liked. One of the characteristics of these leaders who moved their companies from good to great, it might shock us that that Collins characterized them as being quiet, humble, modest, reserved, shy, gracious, mild-mannered, self-effacing, willing to take the blame for mistakes and take no credit for successes. And then Nehemiah gave ultimate glory to God in chapter 6, verse 16. This is when the wall is complete. Listen, this is Nehemiah 6:16. And it came to pass that when all our enemies heard thereof, and all the heathen were about us saw the things which were done, they were much cast down in their own eyes, for they perceived that this work was wrought by our God. And this is one of the greatest qualities of Nehemiah. He didn't take the credit. It has used these leadership principles of dividing the work into manageable sections, delegating responsibility and authority, and then recognizing his workers, all for the glory of God. This is, I think, one of the greatest chapters in Nehemiah. And I've actually read some popular commentaries that skip Nehemiah chapter 3. We don't want to skip this. We want to ask God to help us to be this kind of leader.